5 true scary stories that will send shivers down your spine. The Dog Door by Megan. Shortly after my son was born, my then husband and I bought a 100-year-old house for our expanding family, which included the 3 of us and our medium-large dog. As someone who grew up afraid of the dark after a strange incident with a neighbor boy looking in my windows as a child, I repeatedly had to tell myself that the creaks and thumps and sounds were normal for a house of that age, with old growth trees that bumped the roof and scraped the windows at night, and noisy radiant heat and a back gate that wouldn't stay shut and clanked in the wind. I'd hear something, and instead of investigating, I'd hide under the covers like any reasonable adult. When my then husband and I split up, I kept the creaky house and he kept the medium-large dog. When my son was still small, the 2 of us were watching a movie in the front room around dusk when my phone died. As a Type B personality, the one charger I had was typically strewn somewhere about the house. This time I found it in the kitchen. But as I crossed to the counter to plug it in, I had the overwhelming, goosebumpy, tingly sinking sense that something was very, very wrong. I turned and I realized that not only was the back gate open again, someone was sitting cross-legged in the yard, seemingly staring at the house. They had a hood and dark sunglasses, despite the fleeting light, and didn't move even when I stepped closer to the window to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. They remained eerily motionless when I was certain they could see me, and still even when I was pretty sure they could see that I had seen them. I quickly locked the back door, grabbed my phone and my charger, and headed into the dining room to my laptop, where I sent the first person I could see online a message that someone was sitting in my yard, staring at my house, and that my phone was dead, and to please call the police if they didn't hear from me in a few minutes. I assumed whoever was in the yard would leave once sighted, but nevertheless waited on tenterhooks, impatiently staring at my still useless phone. After an awkward conversation with my son about why we weren't going to the kitchen to get a glass of water, it finally lit up, and I was able to call 911. I tried to calmly explain to the dispatcher that I was sure the person was gone, but begged that they please send an officer to check my yard as the motionless staring was unsettling at best. Keeping me on the phone, she asked if I could look out a window without being seen to verify, as well as check the locked door. I awkwardly crept as stealthily as I could toward the kitchen, slowly realizing that while the back door was locked, it also had a very clearly too large dog door with no functioning way to block it. Panicking, I stood slightly in an attempt to scan the yard and came face to face with a hood and sunglasses staring down at me through the window. At this point, I was incoherent as the dispatcher urged me to grab my son and hightail it to a locked room. I dart back to him and explain we need to go now. And as I pick him up, I hear the clear and unmistakable sound of the dog door slowly swinging open. I abandoned the house, leaving the front door wide open, and dashed across the street to pound on my neighbor's door. Once inside, they kindly paused their dinner party to distract my son while I stared across the street and messily sobbed about our very indoor cat we left behind. Not long after the officers arrived, they came through the side gate with hood and sunglasses in tow. They'd apprehended her calmly sitting on my back step, her arm lazily, purposefully swinging in and out of the dog door. I boarded the dog door shut that night, but we moved shortly thereafter, as I was never quite sure after that if all the nighttime knocks and bumps and open gates I'd been hearing were actually just the old house. Please Just Go by Cloud Dancing Texan. My cousin was shot and killed in the late 90s. He was very young, only 21, a victim of mistaken identity. He and I got along well, and I loved him, of course, but we weren't particularly close, so when I started dreaming of him constantly, it was unnerving and very draining. Years passed. I got married, had a son, moved a couple of times, but I'd still have very lucid dreams of him. It was exhausting. One afternoon, I fell asleep on the couch in our living room while my son played quietly on the floor. My husband had night school, so he didn't get home until 9 or so it was just our son and I that were home. At some point, I realized my son had stopped playing. We just stared at each other. There was a strange sort of tension in the air. While I napped, I had one of those very lucid dreams. I was as I was, napping on the couch, but knew he was approaching our house. I knew, in the dream, that he was dead. The knowledge filled me with a paralyzing feeling of dread. I couldn't move and was very afraid as he walked up our driveway. I could see his shadow walking past the front windows, saw his silhouette through the frosted glass of our front door. In my dream, my son, only a toddler, saw him and stood up and began to approach the door. I couldn't call out to him, warn him away. My son babbled and my cousin cocked his head at the sound. Somehow I was able to move and I enveloped my son in my arms and silently pleaded with my cousin, "I'm so sorry, Stephen, but please, please, I can't. Please go. Please just go." I saw his shoulders slump and he turned away. I felt terrible, but the fear would not let up. I peeked through the window beside the front door and saw him walking away, turning the corner by our garage, and then I startled awake. I looked around outside through the window. All was normal. My son was still playing on the floor. Everything was okay. I picked up a book I'd been reading to take my mind off my disturbing dream. At some point, I set it down and realized my son had also stopped playing. We just stared at each other. There was a strange sort of tension in the air, a ringing in my ears. Suddenly, there was a loud crashing sound. Our glass screen door had shattered. Just up the stairs by what's-her-name. Back in the late 2000s, I was in my early 20s and living happily for a few years as a broke expat in Berlin. One of my roommates, who was from the UK, and I were out late-ish seeing a band play, maybe around midnight or 1 a.m. And afterwards, we were headed home, walking through a relatively central but quiet part of the city towards a subway station entrance. We were in high spirits after a couple drinks and a fun night out, not too drunk, just a little tipsy. And we were laughing and chatting, probably somewhat loudly, as we headed arm in arm towards the subway entrance, which was ahead of us down at the far end of a long, quiet street. It was late October or early November, and still warm enough for it to feel nice to walk outside, and the misty air hung in yellow halos under the streetlights. Just as a little gust of wind blew some leaves across the pavement in front of us, we both became aware of a figure walking ahead of us in the mist. From the back, it appeared to be an older woman, stooped over, carrying bags in each hand, and walking with a very pronounced limp, sort of dragging one of her legs along behind her. We were speaking English and nearly about to pass around her on the sidewalk when the woman cried out rather exaggeratedly, in English but with a thick German accent, "Oh, help! Won't somebody help me?" She didn't sound frightened or worried so much as deeply demanding, and her tone of voice suggested she expected to be helped. My roommate tried to keep us moving ahead past her, but I softened and slowed down my pace, because after all, this was an elderly woman, carrying bags late at night, and she clearly couldn't walk very well. I asked her what she needed help with, and she said, "It's my leg. Help me carry the bags. I live just over there." And she nodded towards an apartment building entryway a half a block up the street. My inner Good Samaritan instincts kicked in, and I responded automatically, "Oh, of course we'll help you." My roommate seemed decidedly less enthused for some reason, but begrudgingly followed me as we each grabbed one of the woman's bags and carted them to the doorstep up the street. As the woman's face came into sharper relief underneath a nearby streetlight, I realized that she looked exactly like a witch out of a German fairy tale. Bent posture, a large wart on her nose, grayish-white straggly hair, and she was wearing dark wool clothing with a hood. I was honestly taken aback by her appearance and nearly gasped out loud, but again, wanting to be polite, I pushed this to the back of my mind. Who cares what she looks like, I told myself. She's just an elderly lady who needs our help. When we arrived at her building's doorstep, the entryway door was surprisingly ajar, not the norm at all in the neighborhood we were in, and she pushed it open easily, suddenly seeming to possess more strength than she had had moments before, and leaned forward to hold it for open me so that I could go in first and she would be behind me. She gestured up a dark and dingy flight of stairs and breathed, "Just up the stairs, just up the stairs." I froze in my tracks for a second in the doorway as my tipsy 23-year-old brain tried to puzzle it out. Logically, the polite thing to do would be to carry the bag up the stairs for this woman, right? But then again, all the hairs were standing up on the back of my neck, and the building's hallway and narrow staircase in the dim fluorescent yellow light looked awfully foreboding. I could just make out a doorway at the top of the stairs on the right-hand side that was also slightly ajar, leading into an apartment. An air of intensely stale, musty smoke wafted down the stairs. And then there was the tone of stark urgency in the woman's voice as she urged me to step fully inside and get up the stairs as quickly as possible. If I had to describe her tone, it wasn't too far from the voice of a cartoon villain rubbing their hands together while hatching a nefarious plan. As I stood in the entryway, tipsily trying to weigh the very bad feeling in the pit of my stomach against my lifelong fear of being impolite, I actually giggled at how absurdly horror movie-esque the moment felt, so much so that it couldn't be a real threat, right? It was too spot on, so I must be imagining it. Fortunately, my roommate, who had seen more shit in her life than I had at that point, literally yelled out, "Oh, hell no!" hooked her arm into mine, and pulled me out the door and down the street as quickly as possible. The old woman yelled disappointedly after us as my roommate whisked me across the street and down the subway stairs, back into the safety of a warm, brightly lit public space full of people. Once we had safely escaped, my roommate shared the two things that had set off definitive alarm bells in her head. One, she was certain that the woman's limp wasn't there initially as she walked ahead of us, and that it had only appeared as we got closer to her. And two, in her words, "As you stood in the doorway, I suddenly knew that she had a creepy adult son waiting for us at the top of the stairs, who was going to chain you to her bed." Perhaps it was just our fanciful imaginations, but I have always felt grateful to my roommate's instincts for keeping us away from whatever was at the top of those stairs. That's Not a Cat by Sala. My rural neighborhood is home to a large feral cat population, and I always keep food and water out for them on my deck. Last spring, I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. I sat down to pee and looked out the window, which has a clear view down over the deck. Looking down at the deck, I saw a large figure at one of the bowls. I was half asleep, and it was quite dark, though there was some ambient light from our garage. And at first I thought it was a raccoon, or a giant skunk, or maybe even a coyote. Then, with the most skin-crawling sense of horror, I realized it was a human man crouched on all fours, eating cat food out of the bowl with his mouth. I whisper-yelled to my husband with, I guess, enough panic in my voice that he immediately got up and came into the bathroom without asking why I was whisper-yelling for him at 2 a.m., and kind of spluttered and pointed out the window. He looked out, and I could see the same reaction play out over his face in the few seconds it took him to realize what was going on. It's a large cat. No. Raccoon. No. Coyote. No. WTF. It's a human? I called 911 and told the dispatcher there was a strange man on our porch acting suspiciously. "Ma'am," he said, "what do you mean suspiciously?" I told him there was a guy eating cat food out of a bowl with his mouth, no hands, on the back deck. He said he'd send a patrol car right over. Meanwhile, my husband tiptoed downstairs to get a baseball bat from a closet, and I continued peeking out the window to keep an eye on the dude, barely believing what I was seeing. At some point, I suppose he must have stopped eating. There wasn't that much food out to begin with, and unless he was eating kibble by kibble, he would have finished very quickly. But he remained in the same hunched, crouched position over the bowl, the back of his head and his face obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. Then, with the most skin-crawling sense of horror, I realized it was a human man crouched on all fours, eating cat food out of the bowl with his mouth. After what felt like hours, but was actually more like 5 or 6 minutes, we saw headlights approaching from down the road. Our visitor must have seen them too, because he got up, easy as you please, walked off our deck, and disappeared into the shadows at the edge of the yard. We had a cruiser parked in our driveway for the rest of the night, and the next morning installed motion-activated lights and a camera. We took the cat food off the deck at night for the rest of the month. We haven't had an unwelcome visitor again, but I will always be afraid of looking out the window in the dark and seeing a man instead of a cat. The Night Terrors by Chaotic Insomniac. Many years ago, our son went through an extreme night terror phase that gradually morphed to include sleepwalking. He was only 3 at the time and not very articulate yet. He didn't seem to remember the night terrors and wasn't afraid of being alone in his room or even of going to bed on his own. Thither he would go without any prompting, and we'd go check on him and see his little sneakers neatly placed beside his bed and him curled up under the covers in his PJs. We found that having him sleep in bed with us prevented these episodes altogether. So for weeks we did just that. It was a bit of a squash, but definitely beat the alternative. But shortly after we resorted to this fix was when the sleepwalking began. One night I felt him clamber over me, and groggily I assumed he had to go to the bathroom and almost instantly fell back to sleep. I woke to his terrified screams, disoriented about where he was. My husband found him, shaking uncontrollably, next to his bed, eyes dilated and blank with horror. We carried him back to our bed, holding him close, and waited for him to fall back asleep. This continued to happen off and on for weeks before my mom brought a lady who was a self-proclaimed curandera, or witch doctor, to our home and had her cleanse it. She said our house had a lot of negative energy from previous tenants and restless spirits of small children who had become attached to our son. This was all horrifying to hear. We had experienced odd things, but none more disconcerting than our son's night terrors. The night terrors stopped after her cleansing, but other activity kicked up, and we continued to have our son sleep in our room, terrified that he'd have another episode. Some of the other experiences were knocks within the walls, doors opening on their own, pictures flying off the wall, doors slamming shut as you approached them, though no one was on the other side to have been able to slam them. We once experienced seeing the shadow of a person, a man, walking around the house, but when we peeked outside, there was no one there. The last straw was when the both of us had the same nightmare, woke drenched in sweat and seeking comfort from the horrifying dream, only to tell it and realize we'd been dreaming nearly the same thing. In the dream, we were across the street, talking to our neighbors when they pointed out that our house was on fire. We looked back and saw that the house was enveloped in black smoke. We could see our son banging his fists helplessly against the front bay window. Panicked, we rushed across the street and into the house searching for him. In my dream, I found him and held him tightly to me as I ran back outside to safety, only to realize the bundle I held in my arms was his baby blanket, and not him. I stared back at the house in time to see it collapse in a fury of flames and woke up screaming. My husband dreamt he went into the house and could hear my son crying out for him and couldn't find him. Then he heard a soft "Daddy" and reached down and grabbed him up and ran outside. As he ran, he realized that our son felt very light in his arms, and when he looked down, he saw he was only holding a teddy bear. Needless to say, this rattled us even more. We promptly moved out, staying in my parents' small guest room until we could sell the house. It wasn't on the market long, and wanting to be upfront about our experiences, we told the buyer against our realtor's advice. He was a much older man who planned to use it as a rental property and waved off our experiences as nervous nonsense. Just Doing Its Job by Jen Yurdy. This was a decade ago now, at a very difficult time in my life. I had moved to Northern California from the Pacific Northwest for grad school, living in a shitty studio provided by the school with too much stuff in it. No real chance to make friends yet. Unemployed for the first time in my adult life, living off what I could scrounge from odd jobs. I had acute PTSD that I believed at that time was going to kill me. I had been suicidal for years before this, and that made it worse. On the afternoon this happened, I was laying in my bed on my side, facing away from the wall with the one window above my head. California sunshine, sounds of campus outside. I was drifting in and out of a nap when the previously warm and brightly lit room went cool, silent, and dark. Weird, but maybe a lull in traffic, a cloud over the late afternoon sun. But soon I felt more, then saw a black shadow behind me. Almost as soon as I sensed the being, I don't know what else to call it, I felt it try to enter me and felt the most pain I've ever experienced. This wasn't sexual at all. Instead, it felt like the black shadow was trying to float into my body. To possess it or just to satisfy its curiosity, I have no idea. But it hurt so badly, like every cell on my body was on fire. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't think I could face what I'd see, and I didn't know anything else I could do to stop it, because it felt imperative to stop it. My whole body was screaming. I could even feel my face form a scream, but nothing came out. The only thing I could think of to do was to just tighten every bone, muscle, tendon, cell in my body and try to force it out, or at least stop its progress. So that's what I did, and it kind of worked. At least, that pushing through feeling stopped for a second. It started up again, and I tightened even further, my body in so much pain from the intrusion that the tightening was almost a relief, and it stopped again. I became aware that I had a sense of a silent emotional response from the being as I relaxed a bit, and it attempted to intrude once more, but more tentatively this time. I tightened once again, and I felt this sense of confusion from the being as they withdrew their hand, body, from mine. They were genuinely confused and somewhat concerned about why I was doing this, why I wasn't allowing them in. Something wasn't going according to what they had planned or expected. I saw a shadowy part of them pass over me out of the corner of my eye. They seemed to be moving over my body, checking it out. I could feel their presence above my skin and get a sense of the size of them. They were just this cloud of black, darker in some parts, but almost see-through in others. They tried one last time, just a tendril. But I knew what worked at this point and tightened again, and the being withdrew their tendril and disappeared. The room was suddenly light again. I could hear sound outside just like before. But I still didn't dare move for quite some time after, terrified it would come back. It never did. But I still didn't sleep for weeks. I still struggled to lay down for a nap. What if it comes back? I don't know what it was or what it wanted. I spent many of those sleepless nights searching online, but got nowhere. It's honestly hard to get good results when you Google, "Dark shadowy thing tried to enter me alien ghost," as it turns out. It seemed like most people would think it was sleep paralysis or hypnagogic hallucinations, but I've read about all of those, and it doesn't fit what I felt. I could move enough to tighten, I could feel my face make expressions, I could move my eyes, and I could feel its emotions, which felt very simple, with no malice at all, like it didn't want to hurt me, and it was really puzzled that it realized or suspected it had. It seemed like the being expected me to be asleep, or, and this is what it really felt like, dead. I don't know if one of my suicide attempts that year wasn't supposed to have been survived and I got on some sort of list, but got spared somehow. Or maybe someone a few apartments over was a few minutes late to their final exit because their ride was delayed by me. Or if it was an alien of some kind. It definitely did not feel human in any way. I truly hope I'll never meet it again, until it's my time to go. But I honestly wish it well. It scared the absolute crap out of me, but I really don't think it meant to. Its actions, whatever they were meant to do, felt remarkably simple and neutral. Like it was just doing a job and corrected its mistake when it realized it. The job was just possession.